Rather than tell my entire vocation story, I just want to focus on one aspect of that story. So this happened in my final year, I guess, at seminary formation. And so basically, in seminary, you can kind of be with the guys and take classes and whatnot. And you kind of forget that eventually you got to make a decision, right? Eventually you got to make a decision as to whether or not you want to go forward and get ordained or leave the seminary and do other things. And so, when it came to my final year, like things were kind of coming to a head. And I remember feeling kind of stressed and overwhelmed by the whole thing. So I did what I would typically do whenever I was feeling kind of stressed and overwhelmed. I would go to see a movie by myself. And I was thinking to myself, okay, whatever's playing at this particular weird time, short of like an overtly immoral movie, like I'll definitely go see that, right? So the movie I went to see was called Diary of a Wimpy Kid. So needless to say, a bit of a spoiler alert here. But basically, there's this wimpy kid, and his whole goal in the movie is to become the most popular kid in school, right? And he has this best friend named Rowley, who's this kind of pudgy kid, socially awkward, but good, loyal, faithful kid. And the wimpy kid comes up with all these schemes, again, to become the most popular kid in school. And, surprise, surprise, they don't work, right? So instead of becoming more popular, he becomes less popular. And anyways, things really come to a head, and basically, it gets to the point where these older kids who are put in a compromised situation partway through the movie because of one of the wimpy kid's failed schemes. The older kids, they kind of capture the wimpy kid and Rowley, and they want to punish basically both of them for this thing that was done earlier on in the movie. And so they're in this playground, and they're looking for something to do in terms of like what to do, again, to punish these kids. And they see this moldy piece of cheese. And if you've seen with Diary of a Wimpy Kid, basically there was this kind of urban legend which developed around this moldy piece of cheese back in the day, and it was explained by this other student, where basically there was this, I guess, Eastern European kid who accidentally touched the piece of cheese, and he developed this thing called the cheese touch, right? And so people just thought like he was gross by touching the cheese, and so he didn't understand English, right? And so it's kind of funny. So he eventually was banished from the school because he was just socially ostracized. And so anyways, there was that situation. And so you just kind of bring it back to the current situation in the movie, just to think it through, right? So if this Eastern European kid is like banished to where he came from because he touched the cheese, what's going to happen to these other people when they're made to eat the cheese? Because that's the punishment that the older kids come up with, right? So they're thinking, okay, let's get these two guys, the Wimpy Kid and Rowley, to eat this moldy piece of cheese, and that'll be their punishment. And so rather than have the Wimpy Kid eat the cheese first, they have Rowley eat the cheese, right? So again, Rowley, good kid, faithful, innocent, right? He was just along for the ride when the Wimpy Kid was trying to live out all these different schemes. And he's the one who's made to eat the moldy piece of cheese. And so he takes a bite, right? He eats the cheese, at which point the recess bell goes off, and all these kids come out from the school, and they see, all the kids together, the older kids, Wimpy Kid, Rowley, and more to the point, they see Rowley with this half, eaten piece of cheese. And they're pointing at him, and they're about to hate him and reject him forever. At which point, the camera turns to Rowley, and he is just devastated. Like, he's just completely crushed. Because he knows, I'm going to be hated and rejected forever. And the Wimpy Kid sees this. This is like the end of the movie, right? And so the Wimpy Kid sees this, and when he does, he steps into the fray, he steps in front of his friend, shields him from the crowd in a certain sense, and says, I ate the cheese. I ate the cheese, And, the whole school, they end up hating him. But he's like, that's fine, like I'll take it so that my friend will be spared. And then, he's reunited with his friend Rowley, and that's how the movie basically ends. And so, the lights come up, and I'm in there with, the mothers and their babies, and Stars and Shores nights, and I'm just like bawling my eyes out, right? Because, a couple reasons. Like, Rowley in that movie, for me, he represented like Christ, certainly so good, so faithful, all those things, but also unloved, right? And we forget this about the Lord, right? Like, he is the embodiment of love itself, right? God is love. But at the same time, like, what does that mean for people? Like, effectively not much. Like, people they're not really in the habit of sacrificing for the Lord because they don't really care. They don't really care about him, despite all these things that he's done for us, right? So the other reason why it was so emotional about the whole thing was because I realized how selfish and prideful and ego-driven I had been as well, right? Because you kind of look back on your time in center formation and you tell yourself in the moment, well, I was discerning, I was discerning whether or not God was calling me to the priesthood or whatever, right? But in reality, what you're doing on some level, or at least what I was doing, was kind of hedging my bets, kind of saying to the Lord on some level, like, you got to guarantee that when I get ordained, if I pursue this path and do this thing that I think you want me to do, like, things are going to work out for me. Like, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be joyful. I'm not going to suffer that much and whatever, right? Where, again, in retrospect, you look back and it's really, prideful and selfish and all these things. Because when I look back, I always knew that I was called to the priesthood. I always knew. But I was afraid. I was afraid that if I went ahead and did this thing, I'd be locked in a stance of depression and whatever forever. And I was afraid of that, and that's why I was kind of hedging my bets, asking the Lord to give me assurances ahead of ordination, whereas in reality I knew he was calling me to the holy priesthood. And so I kind of decided at that moment that, I was kind of focusing on the wrong questions. Like, the questions I should have been focused on weren't so much my questions, they were kind of like the Lord's questions, right? So, like, some variation of what you find in the gospel, right? Like, so first of all, who do you say that I am, right? Like Caesarea Philippi, St. Peter stuff, right? Like, so who do you say that I am? Do you believe I am God? Do you believe I am, the Savior of the world? Do you believe I'm your Father? Do you believe I am the love of your life, basically, right? And then secondly, the corresponding question, again, shades of St. Peter, do you love me? And you see, if the answer is yes, he will always respond with some variation of, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. In other words, he would always respond with some invitation to participate in his mission. And so what ended up happening, even though it might sound kind of strange, I decided ultimately to get ordained, thinking that every single day after I got ordained would be a total disaster, in the sense of being depressed and sad and whatever. But I thought to myself, well, if that's the case, like, so be it, because Christ is Lord, I love him, and what are you going to do, right? If the Lord calls, what are you going to do? Like, how can you not lay down your life in a sense of sacrificial love and service and all those things, right? Now, before I get to kind of how the thing ultimately ended, right, I want to tell you about this conversation I had with my director back in the day, which kind of framed this thing we're talking about, right? So basically, I remember, again, thinking about how things were coming to a head and how I was feeling and stuff. And I remember saying to him through tears, actually, that, I know the Lord is calling me to do this thing, and I feel it's going to end up in disaster. But, I know that he knows that I'm going to do it anyways, even though I feel like it's going to end in disaster and my own personal emptiness and sadness and all these things. And, like, I feel like an idiot for persevering with that particular mindset, right? And I remember my director, God bless him, he said in response, don't you see how much you love the Lord? Don't you see how much you love the Lord? And I had never seen it like that. I had never seen it from that perspective. I always thought, like, well, gosh, if you lay down your life out of service to Christ, if you choose to die to yourself out of love for Christ, like, that means you're a moron. That means you're an idiot. But I want to tell you, friends, like, what I've kind of realized in retrospect was that that is not true, right? Certainly the priesthood is challenging, just like any vocation, right? The priesthood is challenging. But I have never felt the joy that I felt as a priest before in my life. It's an absolutely amazing and incredible. And in a certain sense, especially in those moments where it's hard and it's difficult, but okay, the Lord calls me to be here to do this thing, to persevere, even though it's challenging and difficult. There's a joy even in the midst of that. And so, I got to say, I have absolutely no regrets. The Lord will never be outdone in generosity, right? And living out the Christian life with authenticity, it has to have this vibe. Like, we know this intuitively, but this is where the rubber hits the road. Like, what do you actually believe? The only way to not just find new life, but to live out the church's mission and to bring people to Christ is to really have the courage to lay down your life out of love for Christ.